and she will.
Welcome, everyone. My name's Lori Schreier. I live in Westmoreland, New Hampshire. And this is sponsored by New Hampshire for Safe Technology and Massachusetts for Safe Technology. And I've been involved with issues around wireless for a number of years when I became aware of the dangers and my own sensitivity, and have been learning a lot about how to protect myself and to show others also how to do that. I did buy a meter with my neighbor, a Safe and Sound Pro 2, which Cece will be showing you later. And I've been helping some of the neighbors in Keene, which is nearby, going to their homes and taking measurements. And I wanted to point out that one of the most common problems is people think because they're hardwired that they're safe, but usually they don't know that their printer or some other thing has a wireless device that's still operating, even though they're hardwired. So they need to learn how to turn those off. I just wanted to mention that because I've been doing that lately. So New Hampshire for Safe Tech's mission is to educate New Hampshire residents, legislators, and others interested in learning about the risks of wireless technology and safer solutions, and to build support for passage of protective policy and legislation when there is some out there. It comes and goes, and to educate people in government and schools, workplaces, healthcare venues, and individuals in their homes, which we know is where we get a lot of our exposures to. We support and advocate for these protective measures, especially those proposed by the New Hampshire Commission to study the health and environmental effects of evolving 5G technology. Their report was released in November 2020. And if anyone wants to know more about their suggestions, it's online, and it's a great read for at least the 17-page summary. So I want to thank Jen White and Deb Hodgson, who support, they're not here right now, but they're the founding members of New Hampshire for Safe Technology. And they continue to facilitate these webinars and the Facebook page and the email list that we send out regular notices about issues on this topic. And I'd like to welcome Cece Doucette, who's the founder of Massachusetts for Safe Technology, who's been hosting our forums, webinars for many months now, doing a wonderful job presenting very good detailed scientific information and suggestions on how to be safer. So welcome, Cece, and thank you again for taking the time.
Lori, it's my pleasure and an honor to be here with everybody today to share the incredible work of so many scientists, one of whom is with us here today. Welcome, Dr. Nyberg, and also the medical community. And Dr. Brown, thank you for joining us today. We are so honored to have your time with us. What we'll do to begin our presentation today is I will go through a set of slides that will last about an hour to an hour and a half, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers at the end. Dr. Nyberg and Dr. Brown, if you need to leave before then, but there was something that you would like to say, please feel free to raise a hand and we would love to hear from you. So I'm going to get started by doing a screen share, and that will take just a second or so to come up. Lori, can you give me a nod if you can see that?
Looks good.
Okay, great. All right, so we're going to go through this set of slides and kind of help you connect the dots on what happened with technology when we started using wireless, what the risks are, what the science is telling us, and most importantly, what we can do to still have amazing technology, but without, leaving ourselves exposed to radio frequency microwave radiation. So we will send out a recording of this talk, and we will also send out a copy of my slides. So anywhere in my slides where you see an underline like this, you'll be able to drill down directly into the science and other facts that may help you to connect the dots a little bit quicker than the many years it took us to figure out what was going on with wireless. So this MTPW after my name just means that I have the privilege of earning a master's in technical and professional writing from Northeastern University, where I also earned my bachelor's degree in communication studies. And In a million years, I could have never guessed that this is where I would be applying my skill set to today. But I'm very grateful that speaking publicly is part of my comfort zone and that I can bring this information forward. So when I was raising my daughters, I volunteered to help run our local education foundation in the town of Ashland, Massachusetts. And one night at book group, a girlfriend of mine, Wendy, who was or is an electrical engineer, was reading a book called Zapped by Anne Louise Gittleman. And she was starting to teach us that there could be biological effects with today's wireless tech. And, you know, it was book group and it was the first time I was hearing it. So I just kind of made a mental note and didn't think too much about it until something crossed my desk later that was inferring the same thing, that wireless could be harmful and we need to be careful. So being a tech writer, I just went, I wonder if there's any science to this. And so I went out and just started looking, and I was astounded to discover that there are literally thousands of studies, peer-reviewed, published all over the world today, linking wireless radiation exposures to a host of biological effects. And we're going to go through the science in just a few minutes. So, you know, I had worked for 8 years bringing wireless tech into our schools because the industry was pushing in their 21st century classroom campaign. And they were kind of teaching us that we needed to have all this technology in order for our children to succeed in the world. So, you know, good doobie parents, we jumped in and we started doing fundraising for wireless infrastructure, and then the iPads and the Chromebooks and the smart boards and the minis and the Apple TV and all of this tech that we thought was needed for our children to learn in schools today. When Wendy tipped me off about the harm and I started reading the science, I started sharing it with my schools, and I expected that they would have gotten everybody out of the building, just like if we had had a chemical leak in the science lab. But I was shocked that we got back crickets. And I couldn't figure it out. But ultimately, we became the first in the United States to even have this little sign posted in our classrooms that says best practices for mobile devices. Turn these things off when we're not using them, and only turn on the Wi-Fi when it's needed, and always place the mobile device on a solid surface, not your lap. And, you know, when I was a little girl, my mom used to say, don't stand in front of the TV, you know, and it should be the same with screens. We should not be close to those, because even if the radiation isn't radiating, the electric and magnetic fields that are coming off of our devices could potentially be harmful to us. So, so we became the first in the United States to even have this little sign hanging in our classrooms. And I'll tell you, it was not an easy conversation to have, because industry had already gotten in at the state level with the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education and made all these sweetheart deals to get the technology in. And then they integrated it into the curriculum at the state level. So if our schools aren't using all this technology, they stand to get a poor evaluation at the state level, which in turn impacts their budgets, which in turn impacts the very livelihoods of our school administrators. So that's how I got involved in this issue. And once I got down to the facts, I was like, wow, this feels a whole lot like smoking and alcohol and drugs and pornography and gambling.
Investment account at Fidelity Income and Gains B.
Oh, please mute. Thank you. So I went to my state representative and I went to my state senator, both of whom I had known through our work on the Ashland Education Foundation. And I sat with Senator Karen Spilka, who's now our Senate president, and I showed her the science. And I showed her Ashland's little sign, and then I showed her the radiation coming off of her own cell phone and her district director's laptop. Both devices went way off the charts into the red zone, and they're looking at me with wide eyes like, really? And I said, yes, and nobody knows. I said, is there something from where you sit where we could simply give the public the right to know? Because once we know better, we can do better. So Senator Spilka put me with an attorney in her office back in 2014, And together we whittled out a very simple bill that would form a commission, get the right minds to the table at the state level, look at the facts, and then decide what needs to be done. So here we are in 2013. We've had many bills in Massachusetts, and this session we actually have 6 bills, and we'll give you a peek at that later. But for reasons unknown to me, whether it's industry capture of our government, I can't tell. So, but anyway, it's taken nearly 10 years and we still have not done anything to inform and protect the public. We have made major inroads in New Hampshire, and we will come back and tell you a bit more about that in a few minutes, because that gives us all a bit of hope. While I was doing this work with the schools and the state, somebody over in Europe found my work, and Dr. Deborah Davis referred me to the group that was forming a little nonprofit called Wireless Education. And Dr. Davis knew what we were doing here in Massachusetts. And so I met with Brett and Lynn West out of the UK and Dr. Mikko Ahonen out of Finland. And the 4 of us hit it hard for several months. And we came up with a little online course called Schools and Families that can be completed online in about a half an hour. So we can mass train an entire school district, an entire government organization, your local municipality, your office at work, your family and friends. We have a course that can be completed in about a half an hour online, and it's less than the cost of about a movie ticket, because we do have overhead expenses, but we want to make it affordable. We will also offer sliding scale, bulk discounts for your schools. We just want to make sure that everybody gets properly trained. And then when I first started on this journey, for the first 2 years, I was doing my research, but honestly, I had nobody I could talk to about this. And I was so grateful when Dr. Deborah Davis reached out, and another citizen let me know that they were bringing a panel of world-leading experts to the Massachusetts State House to talk about the right to know and how we need legislation to give the public the right to know. So Dr. Davis is a Nobel Peace Prize co-laureate on climate change. She helped to get tobacco out of airplanes, smoke out of airplanes, and she's made huge inroads on other environmental pollutants. And arguably her organization, which is called the Environmental Health Trust, has the best database in the world to help connect the science, public policy, and medical advisories, as well as representation from the industry community. So I went to the State House to go attend a panel of experts that she brought, including Frank Clegg, who's the retired president of Microsoft Canada, Dr. R.S. Sharma, who is the gentleman in the government with India at that time, who knew that these very high public radiation exposure limits to microwave radiation are too high. And in India, at least on paper, they brought it down 90%. We're still way up here in the US and Canada and other countries. But at least that showed that with political will, we can fix this. And there were other experts who came, and we did that forum. So I was shocked to find that it was a standing room only crowd at the Massachusetts State House. And then I began connecting with others locally, and ultimately we founded Massachusetts for Safe Technology, and I built a website. If you go out there and look at our resources page, you'll be able to find all the science. We've got an events page where you can see where our upcoming webinars are, and if there are other events in Massachusetts that you might like to attend. And then we also have a news page, because one of the major issues with the wireless safety work is that we don't hear about it through mainstream media by and large. But every time something is published locally in Massachusetts, we go ahead and post that. So when you open this conversation and people say, well, I've never heard about this, you can say, yeah, but look what's going on behind the scenes that mainstream media won't cover because they have financial conflicts of interest there. So feel free to use our website in any way that suits your purposes in educating yourself and educating others. Now, I like to include this link here because it's a quick, highly credible way to open this conversation with others. Somebody down at the National Institutes of Health found my work and asked if I would co-chair the technology panel for the Health in Buildings Roundtable Conference. And that was attended by federal agencies. It was attended by architects, urban planners, hospitals, doctors, the green certifying organizations like LEEDs. So we got to present for the first time, I think, to this national group down at the National Institutes of Health. And I was so honored to bring with me Frank Clegg, who's the retired president of Microsoft Canada. When he retired, Dr. Magda Havas and others approached him and said, this is what's really going on with wireless. They measured his home, and he then went and sought out a dozen of the world's leading experts to look at the biological effects of today's wireless tech. And he came back and he said, here in the United States, our FCC guidelines are not safe and protective. Up in Canada, their Safety Code 6 guidelines are not safe and protective. And all throughout Europe, where the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation, or ICNIRP, they've adopted similar guidelines to the FCC that allow this much microwave radiation, and the science is showing the biological harm at hundreds of times below that. So Frank Clegg was very gracious to fly in on his own time and dime to meet us at the National Institutes of Health. And then we had Dr. Martin Paul, who's one of the scientists and researchers on this, to teach us, exactly what the science is. And then we had Peter Sullivan, and I found Peter Sullivan's work through a lecture that he had given. And he had been a fighter pilot in his earlier years, kind of like Top Gun. And then his health started crashing. So he's been up there, way up high with very high levels of natural electromagnetic radiation. And then there's the radar on the planes, and then there's all the instrumentation inside the plane. And Peter's health began to crash, and he started dropping unhealthy weight. His teeth started getting brittle and all these seemingly unrelated symptoms. So Peter had two sons, and when each of his little boys were coming up into the preschool years, each of them started presenting on the autism spectrum. And so Peter started investigating. And knowing what he knows today, a lot of parents who have family members on the autism spectrum will start cleaning up the diet, getting rid of chemicals, going to a clean organic base. They'll go so far sometimes as to detox the body from heavy metals, because heavy metals can affect many of our organs. But today he tells people, as a first line of defense, do the digital detox. Get the wireless out of the home, at least to start with, for 12 hours at night, so the body can do proper cell repair and regeneration, and a child's DNA can develop properly during the sleep cycle. So Peter is an engineer, and he used to work out in Silicon Valley, and his friends were like the folks who invented cell phones. So it was wonderful to have Peter join us at the NIH to talk about solutions. And then we also had Theodora Scarato, who's the executive director of the Environmental Health Trust that Dr. Deborah Davis founded. So I like to share this link because it's highly credible, and we were limited to about 10 minutes each in our talks. So it's not going to overwhelm people. They'll get a quick hit on all the science, the effects. And Theodora talked about what other countries are already doing to protect their children and their communities and their schools and their natural environment. So great resources here for you. And when I fell down the rabbit hole with this issue back in, I guess it was 2013, one of the biggest gaps that we had is we were recognizing that so many people are getting sick, but they go to their doctors, and their doctors run the tests that they know to run, and they come up empty. And then people wind up paying thousands of dollars out of pocket to go see specialists. The specialists run their test, and they come up empty. And here the person is, losing money and still getting very sick, because none of them had been trained yet to identify microwave sickness symptoms and learn how to teach people to remediate, and then how to build back the immune system in other areas that you might gain some of your health back with. So we are so very grateful that in 2021, Libby Kelly, or Elizabeth Kelly, served as the executive director and put together an international EMF medical conference. So let me just take a moment to explain some of the alphabet soup you'll hear as we go through this. So EMF stands for electromagnetic fields. Now the earth has its own pulsation of electromagnetic energy, and it pulses electrons up for you and I and every living thing on the planet at 7.83 times per second. That's something called Schumann's resonance, because he figured out that's what the earth pulses. That's beautiful, healthy, healing energy that we should all be connected to. When we got into getting so fancy with our digital technology, we started working in bigger frequency ranges. So how fast are these coming at us? And how long are these man-made electromagnetic waves? So now that we're working in the megahertz range with our cell phones and all of our other gadgets and our routers and our cell towers and all of that, when we get into megahertz, that means 1 million times per second, we're getting jackhammered with microwave radio frequency radiation. In the gigahertz range, we're getting jackhammered at 1 billion times every second of this spiked pulsed magnetic field, electromagnetic field of radiation. So we call it EMFs, we call it RF for radio frequency, we call it RFR for radio frequency radiation, we call it microwave radiation because there's something called a spectrum of electromagnetic fields, and all of this that we use today with wireless is in that microwave section. I had an engineer sitting in a recording with me in a TV studio one day, and he said, "I don't think that's microwave radiation." And I said, "Okay." Well, he left, and by the end of the program, he came back in and he offered me an apology, and he says, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. You're right. It is microwave radiation." So even people who have been professionally trained in their respective fields are often shocked to find out what this radiation is and biologically what it's doing. So this EMF medical conference, you notice the year was 2021. We were meant to deliver it out in Scottsdale, Arizona, but because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we got shut down, locked down. And so we had to, and bless Libby Kelly, she hired a company, and we all learned together how to present a medical conference online. And then we recorded those lectures. And then during the actual dates of the conference, we played the lectures and then did live Q&A and discussion panels. So the content of this conference just expired this July. We're hoping that the recordings will become available in the near future because the content is still highly relevant. But the accreditation period for the 24.5 continuing medical education credits, that's what's expired. We do not know of another medical conference that's being planned to this magnitude, so we hope that this training will still become available. And as we'll show you in a little bit, there are additional resources that are terrific for our healthcare practitioners to learn from. So that's how I got involved in this. And I think what helped our schools become the first in the country to even have this little sign hanging in our classrooms is when they read the legal fine print. So anybody who's with us today who has an iPhone, I invite you to take that out right now and go into settings. And this legal fine print is in all of our devices. So if you were to just Google or search the make and model of your device and then type in RF for radio frequency, RF exposure, you will be given the fine print that came with your device. And with great thanks to Dr. Davis and Theodore Scarrato and their team at Environmental Health Trust, there's also a website they pulled together called See the Fine Print, where you can look at a lot of these fine print disclaimers. And the Apple iPad, for example, had always said, you know, be careful, this can cause seizures, blackouts, eye strain. And here we've given these tablets to the children with not one shred of technology safety education. So this is critical, especially as we look to getting back into another school year. So once you're in the settings on an iPhone, scroll down just a bit and hit general. On an old phone, you could hit about and then go down to legal and regulatory, because the industry has forced us pretty much to upgrade our phones. Now I think you just go from general to legal and regulatory, but this was a handy little acronym to remember how to get back there. So today you can still remember GAL, like this gal showed you where it is, and then go down to legal and regulatory. Once that screen comes up, you'll see about 4 down RF exposure, which is this 2-way radio frequency microwave radiation that they politely call energy, because it is man-made energy. And in that legal fine print, they tell us a couple of really important things. One, this device was tested at a distance from the body. So if you're holding that device in your hand, or you're tucking it in your bra or your suit, your suit pocket or your shirt pocket, or if you are sticking it in your yoga pants waistband or your back pocket, you are exceeding the FCC guidelines for public radiation exposure. And as we'll learn in a minute, those were never biologically safety tested, and they are not safe to begin with. And then when you go down a paragraph or two, you'll say, if you'd like to, you'll see they're telling you, if you'd like to reduce your exposure, use a hands-free option like a speakerphone or a headset, because otherwise, holding that device, you're being exposed to multiple separate antennas in that device. Each one is individually saying to the cell tower or the router, here I am, where are you? Here I am, where are you? Pinging this microwave radiation many times per second. So our message today is certainly not no technology. We love it and we live by it, but it's high time we understand the facts so that once we know better, we can do better. So I'm going to take a second and do a stop share on my screen, because for every problem we've created, there are wonderful solutions out there. And for those headsets, if you have to use a device while it's actively transmitting, first go into settings, and you will find that there are multiple antennas in there. There's a cellular and a data, a Bluetooth, a Wi-Fi, a locator, a hotspot. And for anybody who didn't know any better and already upgraded to a 5G phone, there are additional antennas in there that can be activated for a 5G connection. And 5G just means 5th generation. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So you would be wise to reduce as much of the radiation as you can, and then only leave on the one antenna for the smallest amount of time that you can get away with. So if you do have to use an actively transmitting device, use speakerphone or set it far away from you. And you can purchase something called a hollow tube or an air tube headset. This plugs into your device. You can get little tiny adapters if there's not a direct connection. And then the metal runs up and connects up to these 2 little ferrite beads. These break the radiation. Now, one of the properties of microwave radiation is it likes metal. It amplifies with metal. So you never want to put something metal transmitting right up to your head. So the transmission breaks with these ferrite beads, but the acoustic still comes through from your device. So you'll hear everything that your device is telling you. But then notice this, it goes up to hollow tubes, like a doctor's stethoscope, right? Hollow tubes, no metal on the earbuds. So when you put these up against your brain, there's no metal to draw in the ambient radiation that's coming off of your devices and everybody around you. So feel free to look online for a hollow tube or an air tube headset. Make sure it has no metal up near the head. I saw one that had magnets, so you could just hang it around your neck when you're not using it, but then the earbuds have the magnets, and that's not a healthy solution. So look for rubber tips. And next, I want to show you what this invisible toxin looks like, because here in my home, knowing what I know, I circled my tail for a while because I didn't have anybody to teach me this stuff. I had to learn it myself. But once I figured out that I was radiating my children and my husband and every pollinator in our environment, I started taking steps to reduce the exposures from everything in my environment. So this is a Safe and Sound Pro 2 meter that Lori mentioned, and notice it's glowing in the green here. In the scientific literature, the flashing green is even the best you can get. In the scientific literature, they recommend that we be at the number 10 on the middle number, which is called the max. So the maximum spike of microwave radiation, they want us to be at 10 or less. The unit of measurement is something called a microwatt per square meter. So like in 3 feet of air, how much radiation is there? In the scientific literature, they want us to be at 10 or less. Right now in my home, I'm at 2.7. So I feel pretty good about the safe environment I've created for my family. But what happens with normal, everyday exposures? So here's my cell phone. I keep it in airplane mode as a rule because I don't need it when I'm indoors. It's only meant to be mobile technology. I simply forward my phone calls from my cell over to my trusted landline, right? And by now, everybody in my world knows that I don't use a cell phone except for emergencies, and they will call me on my landline or shoot me an email. So what happens though, when I take it out of airplane mode and it's transmitting? So I'm not doing anything. I'm just letting those antennas connect or try to connect or make a handshake. And right now, without doing anything, and I'm going to go back into airplane mode because I really don't want to radiate myself. So see, it finally dropped back down from the flashing red, which is off the charts, back down to the flashing green. A moment ago, we were at 2.7 microwatts per square meter. Just turning on my phone and letting those antennas do their thing, we went from 2.7 to 1,530,000 microwatts. And science wants to be us at under 10, not 10,000, just 10. So once we know better, we can definitely do better. Yeah, oh my gosh, is right, Ellen. So nice to see you, darling. So I am going to resume my screen share. And I want to let folks know that, again, for every problem we've created, there is a solution. When I realized there were these meters out there to measure, I thought, well, let's get one for our schools. Let's get one for our library, and then everybody can get the data and then fix it, right? It sounded pretty simple in my little mind. Took me 3 tries to go after a grant from a little pot of money that we have for our community here in Ashland. The first time our select board said, gee, we don't really know about this. Come back next time. 6 months later, I reapplied. They said, gosh, we think this is probably more of a Board of Health issue. So they didn't give me the funding I requested. And then around this time, we had my bill at the legislature. And when I was presenting to the Joint Committee on Public Health on this commission bill that we had, I'm holding up the science, I'm holding up Ashland's little sign, I'm holding up the radiation detection meter. And I was looking at the eyes of every member of the Joint Committee on Public Health, and I could tell that not one of them had any idea that radio frequency microwave radiation from wireless was a major problem. So I was supposed to go back to work full-time as a tech writer once we raised our kids, but then this issue found me. So I said to my husband, I'm going to need a little more time. Would you mind terribly if I took like 6 months and started meeting with the legislature in Massachusetts? And he was very gracious. You know, the poor guy, he's a financial planner, so his world makes sense in terms of dollars and cents. And, you know, I've got a good education, I have a good career, and I was no longer contributing what we thought we were going to be putting into our retirement account. So, but we're lucky we at least had one income. So I head off to the State House, and as I start meeting with all of our legislators, I started the conversation quite simply with, can you please help me understand what you might know about the biological effects of today's wireless tech? And I will tell you that every single legislator, every attorney in their office, every chief of staff, every research analyst that I met with, all of them save for one, said, you know, until you brought it up, I really didn't even know this issue existed. The one said, I know a little bit, but why don't you tell me what you came here to tell me? So I spent about 40 minutes with this gentleman. And then he told me that his father was the physicist who brought the team into Chernobyl when it blew. So he grew up understanding that man-made radio frequency and microwaves and other forms of radiation can be very harmful. But honestly, everybody else was in the dark. So that's when I realized I better double back and go have this conversation with the members of our select board before I submit my next grant application. So I did. I met with one in my home. Our daughters had been raised together at the same time. So she left here telling her daughters, and now her daughters aren't sticking their phones in their bras and are trying to turn it off at night and stuff. I went to another's home where two of the select board members and I met, and I got to do a walkthrough after I shared the facts with them and showed them where all their radiation was emitting from. I met another in a restaurant near his work. And then the fifth one I met in a local business, and he was a retired police officer. And he said, Cece, you had me at hello, because he knew far too many of his brethren in the police force who had gotten the glioblastomas and other tumors from having the radar guns in the back of the police cruisers beaming right through their heads to catch the speeders going by. And another colleague of mine, her husband was a police officer, and she was telling me that they knew of a lot of the cops getting thigh cancers from holding the radar guns on their thighs while they're monitoring traffic. So after I educated everybody one by one, then I resubmitted my grant application. And, you know, because we don't hear about it in mainstream, they understood that I was presenting irrefutable facts, but it was still a little, you know, nerve-wracking for them because they hadn't heard of it from anybody else. So what they did is they gave me funding for one acoustimeter, a $400 radio frequency detection meter, to put on loan in our public library conditionally, if the library would agree to take it into circulation. And so I had to then go present to the library board of trustees, and there were 5 of them. And one older gentleman sat there like this, just, you know, you looked at him and you could tell he's thinking, this is just hogwash. Another one, after I taught the facts, said, wow, I want that meter. I want to take it home and I want to measure what's going on in my house. And then a third one said, well, I understand, you know, everybody's feelings on this, but as a public library, we are a central conduit of, information in our community. So I think we should take a vote. So they voted 4-1 to put the acoustimeter on loan in the Ashland Public Library. So today, anybody with an Ashland Public Library card can take it out for a week or two, take it home, take it to their car, measure there, take it to their office, go, you know, wherever they go, their playing fields, their churches, just go out and get the facts, go measure. And that inspired another one to go on loan in the Newton Public Library here in Massachusetts. And a doctor and I went after a state level cultural council grant for that one. And then out in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, more recently, Verizon 3 years ago put a cell tower on top of this neighborhood illegally. They turned on 6 antennas. It's licensed for 48. They turned on 6 antennas. And that very day, people started getting sick. Long story short, after a year and a half of these citizens meeting with their select board, with their board of health, trying to meet with the mayor, their town finally ordered their board of health to investigate. The Pittsfield Department of Public Health and their board of health met with doctors, scientists, engineers, and listened to what the industry messaging was. And for the first time in the United States, the Pittsfield Board of Health issued an emergency order to Verizon to come to the table and tell them why they shouldn't issue an immediate cease and desist order. Instead of being a good corporate citizen, Verizon went to the courts to get an injunction against that Board of Health. Well, the Board of Health had done their homework. They had already met with the state level Massachusetts Board of Health agency or association. And what they believe they have determined is that right now, the Federal Communications Commission is sitting on guidelines that they wrote up in 1996 before we had any of this electro pollution like we're faced with from so many directions today. And they determined that those FCC guidelines that strip local control from saying, hey, you can't put a cell tower here or you can't put a cell tower there. The Pittsfield Board of Health has determined, they believe, that those FCC guidelines only apply to the application process and the siting of the cell towers. Once something goes into the community, if it's creating a nuisance or if it's creating a public health or an environmental health problem, jurisdiction then goes over to the Department of Health at the local level because they are legally responsible for the health and well-being of their community. So the industry tried to shut down the Pittsfield Board of Health, and now there's a civil suit out there to restore the power back to the Board of Health so they can do their job. So Pittsfield now has a Safe and Sound Pro 2 meter. This is the one that we just used for our demonstration. This is the one we would recommend today. It was recommended at the medical conference for doctors to put into their practices to loan out to their patients to go home and measure the exposures and then come back, and they will then talk about how to have safe technology. So they're both great meters. They're both in the $400 range. And in Pittsfield, their library took it right out of their budget and just bought it. So here in Ashland and Newton, we went after grants that we knew about. But now, today, it's a great time to ask your library to put one of these on loan because most libraries today now have a library of things. So they've got a bunch of gadgets that you can then borrow and bring back after a week or two. So feel free to ask your library. If your library does not have the funding but would be interested in putting one on loan, please contact the Environmental Health Trust. I just learned from Theodora Scarrato recently that they have a small pot of funding that if a library, not the citizens, but the library has to contact them directly. And there may be some funding to put one on loan in your community. And then once you do that, we already have a 23-minute public service announcement that my wonderful local cable station did. WACA TV here in Ashland sent a gentleman over with his professional camera, and we did a walkthrough to show all the common exposures that we've all fallen prey to in our own homes, and then suggestions simply to how to remediate. So that's there for anybody who wants to watch it. And then I'm so grateful that Patricia Burke, who has been working on the smart meter and safe technology issue here in Massachusetts for a decade, she invited me to join her for a number of interviews out in Worcester, Massachusetts at WCCA TV. And the director there just recently offered me a slot twice a month where I get to go to the studio for 2 months and record half-hour episodes or 28 minutes. And so we've now got, I think, 14 in our Tech Safe series. So anybody's welcome to go watch them. If you find value in them, then share them. Ask your local cable stations if they can run this series as well. So we're recording the second and the fourth Friday of every month between 11 and 1 p.m., 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. So if you'd like to be a guest to share what your experiences have been, please reach out and we would love to tell your story. Okay, so we don't want anybody to take our word for any of this. We want to present with you, to you now, the science. We're going to first look at the long-term effects, and then we're going to look at the short-term effects. So long-term, child and adult cancers. So for years, the industry has spun it that, oh, you know, more research is needed. And if they talk about this at all, it's usually cancer related. Because back in the 90s, on the Larry King Live, it was either the husband or the neuro-oncologist, Dr. David Perlmutter, who got on Larry King Live, and they basically said that this woman had died from a brain tumor, oddly on the side of her head, not, within the brain like it would normally start, but on the side of her brain. And it lined up with the antennas in her cell phone. When Larry King aired that episode, it became a public relations nightmare overnight for the wireless industry. And so they stepped up and said, oh my goodness, no, this is terrible. We have the financing. Let us partner with the US federal government and we will do the research on this. They should have done it before they were allowed to bring it to market, but that didn't happen either. So they hired this Dr. George Carlo. He put in place a team of about 200 scientists, and for years they did the scientific investigation. Dr. Carlo came back to the head of the industry at the time and said, yeah, it does look like that cell phone killed that woman, and children are especially vulnerable because their bodies are still developing. So some countries at that point invoked what's called the precautionary principle. And that basically says, if there's enough science already to show that we need to be careful here, even though the science isn't fully conclusive yet, we should be taking precautions. That's the precautionary principle. Here in the US, we did not do that. We continue to promote these toxic products in wireless infrastructure. So that was back in the 90s. And then another study was done. The Government Accountability Office said to the FCC back in 2012, 2013, it looks like we're out of sync between the science and what's happening with public radiation exposure limits. What can we do to get those back in sync? So the FCC opened up a docket, and that means it's a file that all the scientists and the doctors and the sick people and their loved ones can put in all of the facts. So that was happening behind the scenes from 2013 on. Meanwhile, a 20-year, $30 million study was happening that our Food and Drug Administration had commissioned, and they engaged the US National Toxicology Program, which is one of the gold standard investigators of toxins in the world. They engaged the National Toxicology Program to see if cell phones could be unsafe. And once they had all their studies done and completed, they had an unprecedented 3-day peer review at the National Institutes of Health. And at the end of the day, their final report concludes clear evidence of cancerous tumors and DNA damage. So tumors of the Schwann cells, the lining of the heart. There were evidence of tumors around the acoustic neuromas. We have other studies with thyroid cancers. So we know scientifically this causes cancer and DNA damage. Well, one of the things the industry likes to do when a good study comes out is bury it, because they own mainstream media by and large. And then they also will spin it and say, oh, that's just one study. You need more than one study to prove anything is a fact. Well, right on the heels of our $30 million cell phone study, the Ramazzini Institute in Italy completed another very large study on cell towers and what's coming off of those base stations. And guess what? They found the same thing that we found. And it's not a surprise, because as far back as 2011, the World Health Organization classified this man-made radiation as a group 2B possible human carcinogen. And that's in the same category as lead and thalidomide and chloroform and a whole host of other chemicals that I can't even pronounce. So what was missing in 2011 were these animal studies, and now they're done. And now the scientific community, many of them are calling for this to be reclassified as a group 1 human carcinogen. And once that classification, or even the one in between, a probable human carcinogen, then the industry has to do something, and our governments have to do something. So the industry's been trying to stifle all of this. But we know scientifically this causes cancers and DNA damage. And it was actually, back in 2013, before these studies were available, I was investigating the infertility studies, and I was reading that they've taken male human sperm, exposed it to a laptop with the radiating antennas, and it changed the DNA, which is our roadmap to grow a proper anything from a child to a plant to an animal to any kind of biome out there. So it causes DNA damage, it slowed the motility of the sperm, and it caused far fewer sperm to be viable or programmed cell death or apoptosis in just 4 hours of exposure to a laptop. And I went, you've got to be kidding me. I had just sent my oldest daughter off to college with her MacBook. Our youngest had just gone into high school, and for Christmas, we gave her a laptop, and where both my girls using it, but right on top of their reproductive organs. And now we have additional studies that show higher miscarriage rates when women are using wireless technology. And there's a whole thick stack of science on infertility. So that was actually the set of studies that allowed me to pluck up the courage to go start talking about this issue locally with my town and my schools. And then the neurotoxicity is a huge factor today. So even before the pandemic, even before we locked down our society, even before we handed every single student a wireless device to go home and access their education, we were already at epidemic levels of anxiety and depression in our societies, our technologically advanced societies, and we are seeing suicide, even among children, higher than we have ever seen. What the science is showing us is that this pulsation of microwave radiation barraging our brain is causing damage to the lining of the brain. We've got something called the blood-brain barrier, and that is meant to keep the brain protected from toxins as the body cleans up through regular cell repair and regeneration and starts dumping those toxins out of the body through the bloodstream. We always have this protective barrier. Now the science from Dr. Palpatcher and other colleagues is showing us that when we radiate the brain, these spikes open up or permeate that blood-brain barrier. So now it's opening up, and as the toxins are going out through the bloodstream, they can now take a turn and go in and contaminate the brain. So it's no surprise to the scientific community that has studied this that we are seeing greater increases in ADD, ADHD, Alzheimer's, and other neurotoxic diseases. Dr. Hugh Taylor runs the OBGYN program at Yale Medical, and he has done some of the rodent studies, and he said that they radiated the pregnant mice for a certain number of hours a day, and then when those pups came out, they were bouncing off the walls without a care in the world, without concentration and focus, what looked to them like ADD or ADHD in a human child. Dr. Martha Herbert founded the Autism Lab at Massachusetts General Hospital. She's a pediatric neurologist from Harvard, and she sees huge connections between what we know scientifically will happen with cumulative exposure to microwaves and what she sees happening in the families in her care. And then Alzheimer's disease used to be like cancer, where it would take, decades to surface. Now, Dr. Martin Pall has culled the science and is showing that we are seeing Alzheimer's not just in 70 and 80 and beyond year olds, but we're now seeing Alzheimer's begin in 60-year-olds and 50s, 40s, 30s, and even in some rare cases in 20-year-olds. How long can we continue to live in electrosmog and not expect that our brain's going to take a major hit? I've mentioned that mainstream media is owned by and large by these same corporations that put out this toxic environmental pollutant. And it's always so wonderful to see mainstream groups start reporting on this. And I, as a mom, first learned about the Environmental Working Group because every year they put out a list called the Clean 15 and the Dirty Dozen. Those are recommendations based on science on what foods you can buy commercially grown versus what you should really try and get organically grown based on how much pesticide residue seeps in to the produce. So I knew about environmental working group, or EWG, as a mom because of that. And now they have gotten funding and they have a PhD on staff who is putting out information and working up in Washington, DC to bring light to the environmental effects of wireless radiation. They have a great fact sheet on protecting kids from wireless radiation in school and at home. This is a great one to share today with your schools as we gear up for the next school year. They also did one on radio frequency radiation and the nervous system. So thank you for everybody who's doing their part to get word out about this. And we need to know that children are especially vulnerable. They're not just little adults. This is a study that was completed by Dr. Om Gandhi and his colleagues. And Dr. Gandhi did this modeling to see how far the radiation penetrates into the brain when you put an active cell phone up to the brain. So these head models are turned sideways. The little yellow dot here is the ear. On an adult, because we have a fully formed skull and our water content in our brain isn't as high as a child's, we are radiating our brain about a third of the way through. On a 10-year-old child whose skull is not fully formed and whose brain has a higher water content, which microwaves really dig water, right? It's going through a 10-year-old's brain inside, penetrating, radiating the brain about 3/4 of the way through. And here on a 5-year-old child, their poor little head, it's microwaving almost the entire brain. So we wonder why we have so much neurotoxicity in our world today. And that's just the cell phone. We need to look at all the devices that we have control over. So those are some of the long-term effects. In the short-term effects, a lot of people will recognize what we're going to cover next. And the good news is that with a little courage and a little education, you can control a lot of this. And people decide they're finally going to give it a go. And they come back and say, whoa, I didn't want to know this. I didn't want to believe it because I live on my devices. And again, we're not taking anybody's devices away. We just want to teach you how to use them more safely. But they'll say, I took a chance. I turned it all off. And oh my gosh, we slept through the night for the first time in ages, or my children's behavior issues calmed way down. So here's what people often experience. And you should know that the Americans with Disabilities Act has long since recognized that these electromagnetic sensitivities exist. And if you go to this link, you will see recommendations for accommodations. We need much more teeth behind these, but it's highly credible to say, I know you might be hearing about it for the first time, but the ADA has recognized this for a couple of decades here. Insomnia. In the wee hours of darkness, because we are beings of light, we operate off of our circadian rhythm, which operates off of light and dark. So every organ in that 24-hour cycle does its reset at some point. And in the wee hours of darkness, the pineal gland in the brain releases melatonin. Melatonin then goes in and it helps to regulate our sleep. And it also helps to escort the toxins of the day out of the bloodstream. So what happens when we leave this man-made light energy form pulsating at us all night long? Well, our poor brains have a hard time distinguishing from man-made light and natural light. And it's sitting there going, okay, when's it going to get dark so I can release the melatonin? So if we don't release the melatonin properly, we wind up with insomnia. And then there's another effect happening that's called the rouleau effect. So in my little brain, I remember it because it's kind of like those candies, Rolos, the stacked up caramels that come in a sleeve. When we radiate our blood, it creates this rouleau effect. Our red blood cells are meant to be free floating and bringing oxygen up to all of our organs and all of our tissue and our skin and everything else. Nice, free-floating red blood cells, bringing oxygen. When we expose ourselves to electromagnetic fields, we find that our blood cells start clumping up together, and they create this rouleau effect where now you've got a stack that looks like, you know, the Rolo candy or a stack of coins that then can't travel to bring the oxygen where it needs to go. So we see an increase in headaches. We see nosebleeds and ear bleeds. We have chronic fatigue. We have pain from unidentified sources as our bodies are being starved of oxygen. With the skin, what the science has shown us is that we have little antennas in the surface of our skin that help us to navigate our way through our world. When we pulsate the skin with these non-natural microwaves, our skin becomes overwhelmed. And so we start seeing skin abnormalities, like some people talk about the hot ear from having the cell phone up to their head. They will start having itching or burning or rashes or nerve damage if they're sticking their phones in their, pockets. Also, our heart is one of our largest bioelectrical organs, and we know that it can cause it to go too fast or too slow based on your own individual proclivity. Cognitive impairment, if we're not getting proper blood flow, and if we're introducing toxins into the brain. This one scared me at the EMF medical conference. We had doctors telling us that if we don't get this radiation out of our environments, we can very well expect to see more of these anger outbursts and behavioral issues like we've been seeing with the mass shootings. After the kids in Massachusetts went back to school, in the news, we were hearing stories from 3 different school districts of kids so angry that they were literally wailing on each other with their tablets. So we have got to get ahead of this. The science shows that this radio frequency radiation is changing the gray matter and the white matter of the brain, where we would otherwise be making better decisions. And again, the anxiety, depression, and suicide. So it's not just you and I, it's every biological cell on the planet is meant to be in sync with the Earth's electromagnetic field, which pulses at 7.83 times per second. And here with our gigahertz and megahertz, we're pulsating in the millions and billions. So what do we suppose that's doing to our birds and our bees and our trees and every other biome out there? For our pollinators, there's a strong body of science that shows it dysregulates the pollinators and the birds. Each of them, kind of like our little antennas in our skin, each of them have navigational properties in their beaks or their brains that allow them to stay in sync with the Earth's electromagnetic field that allows them to navigate where they need to go and back to their hives and so forth, or their nests. And we are dysregulating a lot of that. And so when we talk about our colony collapses and so forth, it is definitely impacted by the neonicotinoids and all the other chemicals in the environment. But this is a major missing piece that we need to start incorporating in these conversations. There were reports out of The Hague in the Netherlands when they were testing 5G that the birds were just dropping by the score from the skies, whether they were stunned or outright killed from the radio frequency. And then energy consumption. So as we hear so much talk about energy consumption and climate change, we need to enter this heavily into the conversation. So there was a Greenpeace analyst back in 2012 that said, if the cloud were a country, it would be the 5th largest consumer of energy in the world. And that was more than a decade ago. And look at all that we've added on top of that. So we've got to get serious about safe technology. And down in the Congo and elsewhere, we're not taught to think about our devices having scores, dozens of minerals required for them to work. If we really understood the human atrocities that are going on down in the Congo and elsewhere to mine all of this, we would never just cast aside our device because there's a a better, shinier one being promoted by the industry. We would use everything to its full useful life and then recycle it and repurpose everything that's in there. Data warehouses, networks, our personal devices, every time we stream, send, receive, charge, and recharge, and everything that we've been sweet talked into putting on our devices with dozens and dozens of apps, they're in the background continuously using energy to do updates. So again, the message is not no technology, it's safe technology. And once we know better, we can choose when we're not on the go to use hardwired connections without any wireless radiation. And then we have great technology. You know, don't stream live, download it to your device and then turn off the antennas. So there's a lot we can do in pretty short order. And, you know, as I learned all of this, I kept looking over my shoulder going, surely somebody's got to have our backs on this, because if it's as bad as little me can find in the scientific literature, somebody's got to be protecting us. And then in 2015, Harvard Law School Center for Ethics came out with this amazing 59-page report that's free and available here online that talks about how the Federal Communications Commission is dominated actually by the industries it's supposed to be protecting us from. So you notice they chose a revolving door as their graphic here. And that's what's happened in many of our federal agencies today. The industries are there and they're making laws to protect their profits and not you and I. So that was my missing puzzle piece. And that's when I went, oh man. So you mean I got to start talking about this? So, and then more recently, ProPublica has put out a good article on how the FCC shields the cell phone companies from safety concerns. And, you know, that $30 million study that the FDA commissioned, that was 2 decades ago. All those people from back then are long gone. We don't have any experts in our government on radio frequency anymore. They are gone, retired, or have passed away. Today, the gentleman in charge of the FDA's radiation control is Dr. Jeffrey Shuren. Now, when the National Toxicology Program completed that $30 million study that determined clear evidence of cancers and tumors, Dr. Shuren and the FDA were supposed to translate that into public policy to protect us, but that's not what happened. Dr. Shuren went over to the FCC and said, we don't really believe that study, so let's just keep doing what we're doing. When you look at Dr. Shuren's background, and again, you don't have to look very far, you will find that he is married to a partner in a law firm that represents the wireless industry. He has a major conflict of interest and should be nowhere near any decisions around radiation exposure limits. But again, we have captured federal agencies. So we know what's happening, we know why it's happening, and the message today is don't wait. There is no cavalry coming. There's nobody coming to make this right in your home or in your community. So we're going to teach you how to do that. And like I said, this goes all the way up to the World Health Organization. If you just, if you just do a search on World Health Organization, wireless radiation or EMFs or radio frequency, you will find things that will make you say, gee, it's inconclusive. And then you'll walk away and go, it must be fine, so I'm going to keep doing what I've always been doing. How would you know that after these $1 million studies were done and provided the animal studies that were missing back in 2011 when they determined this is a group 2B possible human carcinogen? How would you know that those studies were completed and that the World Health Organization has reopened its investigation? Sadly, there are conflicts of interest all the way up at the World Health Organization. There are 2 EMF groups. One is largely funded and staffed by industry. The second is the actual scientists who are trying to get the information out and protect the public. So we're just sitting here waiting. There's a multi-year investigation going on. We don't hold our breath because we know that the industry has deep pockets and heavy influence. So we stay tuned to it, but we keep moving forward to protect ourselves. So let's get to the good news. What can we do? Here's what you can do in your own home. Go look at your router. On the bottom or behind, you're going to find jacks for Ethernet cables. get Ethernet cables, get a big long one and run it to wherever, your electrician can help you. When we first got started, we just kind of snaked it up through the AC vents in our home. Sure, we had a wire hanging out on our living room wall, but we could run an Ethernet cable from the jack in the wall all the way up to our daughter's bedroom so that they could have safe technology. They were both in college by then, and we never let them have tech in their bedroom when they were kids. So you get a cable, get a shielded one if you can. There's another man-made form of dirty electricity that comes off of the wires in residential areas. So get a shielded cable. It's just a few dollar upgrade. And then if you have multiple devices like most homes do today, you can buy an Ethernet switch that will allow you to use it as like an electronics extension cord. So you plug in one cable from your router to the switch, and then you get little cables and plug in all your devices. And then, it's not rocket science once you know, like this is the setup for an iPhone. You would plug this into the switch or directly into the router. And then you just get this little $30 adapter, a lightning adapter, and plug it into your phone, and then forward your cell phone calls when you're not on the go to a landline. And if you gave up your landline, just rethink that. You're probably getting charged the same from your internet service provider, whether you're using that landline or not. So forward cell phone calls to the landline. Anything that you do surfing wise and stuff, you can definitely do on your cell phone with the antennas turned off. Same thing with your router. Once you have plugged everything in, that has multiple antennas in it. So you want to get in touch with your internet service provider and say, I've chosen hardwired technology. I've learned that it's much safer, and you will be pleasantly surprised to see that it's so much faster going through a wire instead of all your signal dissipating throughout the air. It's all going straight through a wire. So your signal is faster and far more reliable. Your data is not flying out there for anybody to capture. They can harvest it through the air. So always go through a wire if you want to protect your security and your privacy, your health, and your speed and your reliability and your energy consumption. So all the great reasons for having hardwired technology. Again, the one thing you do lose is convenience, because you can no longer walk everywhere you want to walk and just, send cute little emojis off to your loved ones. But most people agree the trade-off is worth it to have safe technology. And then you kind of get your life back, because you can just say, I'm not going to use it unless I'm hardwired. And then you won't be tethered all the time to your device. So a lot of people appreciate this education because it kind of gives them their freedom back. So do the same thing with your tablets and laptops. Just get the adapters, look up your make and model, make sure you get the right one. And then you can just buy the corded landline. This is one, it's an AT&T CL2909. I looked up people who are electrically sensitive, what phones do they like to use. This is a preferred one because it doesn't require an electrical plug in addition to the jack in the wall. This one is battery operated, and then you don't have dirty electricity coming off of the electrical wire, because for some people that is an actual biological health problem. So first step, here's what the hardwiring setup looks like. Second step, go into everything that has an antenna, find every antenna and turn it off. The third step then is to measure to make sure that you got them all, because with 5G and the Internet of Things, they are putting these antennas in just about every device that you buy, from your iPod. They want you they want you to put an iPad on the potty seat while you're training your child to use a toilet. They have also come up with some little monitor that you can snap on to the baby's diaper that will tell you if the baby has soiled the diaper, and then that will send a radio frequency signal to your cell phone so you can go change the baby. Come on, folks. Pick up that baby and do the sniff test like we all did. Do not radiate your child. And then in other areas, all of our appliances are now being marketed as smart. So you want to make sure that you understand what that means. when my stove was delivered, my range, it had smart capability. And so I went into the settings to see if I could turn that off, and there was no setting in there for the Wi-Fi. So I looked up the manual, and the manual said, stay, I think it was like 20 centimeters away from this radiation. And I'm like, well, fancy that. How am I going to cook my dinner standing in the middle of my kitchen, or stand at my stove and cook myself, right? So there was nothing in there that allowed me to turn it off. We could turn it off on our television because it had an Ethernet jack in the back, and we could just run the Ethernet cable, go into settings, and turn off the antennas. But on that stove, I had to call tech support. The technician came to my home, and I told him what I wanted. I showed him that my stove was radiating at 1,090,000 microwatts per square meter, and that my goal was to get it back under 10, and he didn't have any idea what I was talking about. So he went and sat out in his van and came back in after he spoke to one of his engineers, and all he had to do was pull off the back of the stove, and behind the digital display there was that motherboard, and then next to it was this little tiny motherboard that had the Wi-Fi antenna on. All he had to do was pop that off, and he just tied it up in a little, nice little thing so it wasn't getting in the way of anything. And then he screwed the back of my stove back on, and I measured, I was back down under 10 in my home instead of 1,090,000. So it's really advisable to be able to measure, because one day I was sitting here and I had slept well. I ate a clean organic breakfast, and after an hour or two at my desk, it just felt like the earth was sucking me down again. And I've never felt good under fluorescent light. So I know that my body's giving me biofeedback that these man-made energies can be dangerous. So I turned around, well, I got my meter out and I started scanning my environment, and it was my printer. Well, my daughter had been home over the weekend and asked if she could print something from her laptop upstairs. And, Mom, can I turn on the Wi-Fi? And I said, yeah, just be sure to turn it back off when you're done. So I looked at my printer, and the little faceplate that has the Wi-Fi logo on it usually glows if the Wi-Fi is on, but it wasn't glowing. But I was still getting off the chart readings on my meter. And I'm like, what is up with that? So I went online and I pulled up the manual for my printer, and it turns out there were 3 antennas in my printer. And all I had to do was go into the settings and turn off those additional antennas in there, and then measure, and then I was safe again. So I highly advise asking your library to put one of these on loan, or if you are financially able, just go buy one. The Safe and Sound Pro 2 is in the $400 range. There's a little sister one that's in the $200 range. I know that Lori, who's co-hosting with us today, she went in on it with her neighbors and they split the cost. So many ways, but if you don't measure, you don't know if you've gotten it all. Okay, so I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about the emissions that you and I might not have direct control over. So everything that you have control over, do your best, start taking baby steps. What can I notice first of all, and then what can I start reducing? Now, when I was a little girl and we would be playing hide and seek, I'm one of 10 kids, so sometimes it would take a very long time to be found, and I'd just be in there in the bushes, waiting to be found. And I would start watching those little dials go around and around and around on the utility meters that were mounted on the side of our home. Those were good old analog mechanical meters that measured how much of the utility service we used for gas, water, electric. Today, we also have to look at solar, maybe propane. But since then, the industry has come to our towns and said, hey, we know you have to pay those meter readers to go walk the community and get those readings. We can save you some money. So first they started with digital meters that would send a signal out to the curb so that when the Department of Public Utilities truck would come by, the employee would aim their scanner at our meter and get the reading and do the billing for us. So that was the first way that these were starting to be introduced in our communities. And I went down to the Department of Public Utilities in my little town, and I asked if they could kind of give me a tour of how that works from their end. And he was showing me the water meters, and they have a little test set up, and they've got the water meter connected to it. And when the water runs through the pipes, it measures how much water is being consumed. And then they put this little attachment on it that had the radio frequency transmitter on. And so they were about to deploy a bucket of these new little meters in our community. And I just put my radio frequency detection meter in the bucket, and it just started pinging red, ping, 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 ping. And so when I was testifying before the Joint Committee on Public, or on, when I was testifying before the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities, I went and sat on my living room floor against the wall, where on the outside we have 2 electric meters mounted. I wanted to know for myself, how often do these things radiate? And I sat there and I did a little 3-minute video that I submitted to the Department of Public Utilities as part of my testimony. And when you do the math after counting the pings for like 30 seconds, it comes out to, 12 times a minute, or 17,000 times in a 24-hour period that those meters are pulsing microwaves into my family. So that's not good. So they pulse this radiation continuously. And remember, I said one of the properties of this radiation is it likes metal, it amplifies on metal. So if things are not properly installed and grounded, you may find yourself in a house where the radiation is hopping on the pipes or the wires and traveling on it and turning your whole house into one giant radio frequency antenna. There are far too many reports of power outages and then surges and fires and explosions if everything is not properly grounded and secured. And then there's these huge issues with industry capturing our data, knowing what we're using and when. And then they can sell that information off to third-party providers or more nefarious organizations, some would believe. But from the health perspective, I love this brochure from our friend Josh at Stop Smart Meters. You definitely don't want to have anybody ever spending any time on the other side of the wall where these things are mounted. We know scientifically that children, pregnant women, the elderly, anybody with an existing health condition is even more vulnerable than you and I. And we know from the EMF Medical Conference that these smart meters or digital meters, when they go in, are one of the leading causes of sudden onset microwave sickness. So we need to just be aware of where everything is on our home and then start talking about how to do better. This, like so many environmental pollutants, is another environmental justice issue where these toxic companies come in, they roll out their toxic products. In this case, in Worcester, Massachusetts, National Grid came in and rolled out the smart grid. So not only would you have a digital device on your home, but it would then capture your data, send it by way of the next house and the next house and this whole chain. And all this radiation grows as it goes from house to house, and then it goes to a collection point, maybe up on a pole in your neighborhood. And mind you, thieves and hackers and terrorists and anybody can access this wireless data, and then it goes to the utility company that can then sell it off. So there's big money in harvesting our data. And if they can do it through these wireless connections, it's a lot faster and cheaper for them. Although in Chattanooga, Tennessee, they have actually hardwired the meters to the homes with no radio frequency signals. So there are solutions out there. But in Worcester, National Grid rolled out this pilot program for the smart grid, and they went way over budget, and they wanted to turn around and slap the ratepayers or the consumer, the customer, with having to pay for their inaccuracies in their budgeting. And our Attorney General's office got involved, and I went in and tried to educate our Attorney General's office that it's not just about economics, It's about the biological effect. So we're trying to educate at the state level on all levels. Oftentimes when we open up this conversation about the need to have safe technology and we say wireless is harmful, people, because of the way they've been conditioned, will automatically go, oh, tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist. So we have wonderful resources from many different professions to help us through those conversations. Jeremy Johnson was a Silicon Valley engineer and his wife was a medical doctor, or is, and nothing in her training could help them understand why they both suddenly got so sick. Bottom line, it was a bank of smart meters that went in at their condo. So Jeremy has done this TEDx talk, and you may know that these are all like 15 minutes or so. It's a great one to share with others who don't want to believe that this is true. Dr. Alexia McKnight is a doctor of radiology. She specializes in veterinarian large animal medicine. And she got fried when a smart meter went in on her home, to the point where she would be out in traffic and could no longer remember if a green light meant stop or go. And other biological harm was happening. She's also done a TED Talk. So feel free to use these resources, use them to learn further for yourself, and then share with others. And so we have our own devices, we have those smart meters, and then we have cell towers. We started with cell towers, 300 feet up in the air, way off in industrial areas. And then they started encroaching closer and closer and closer to where you and I live, work, play, worship, study. So it's critically important, if you want to understand the science, to look at the non-industry funded science, because another tactic in the big tobacco playbook that the wireless industry is using is that anytime a good study comes out, they'll do their own study under conditions that are done deliberately to show no harm. But we need to understand that no harm is never the same thing as safe. They just do this study under conditions that would show no harm, right? So it's critically important to study the non-industry funded science. If you want to take a look, you know, being a tech writer, as I was looking at all the science, I started getting way in over my head, and then I couldn't remember where to find credible information. So being a tech writer, I just started building out my own little research repository, and I have a page on cell towers where I can quickly get back to the science. And if this does you any good, by all means, use it, share it, you know, use it as a launch point to your own investigation. But here's the science that shows we should never have allowed any cell infrastructure or transmitting infrastructure like smart meters within 500 meters of where we are. And 500 meters equates to 1,640 feet. And the reason why the science advises that as a minimum distance is because there's this slope of death and neurotoxicity and other harm that within 500 meters, we see higher levels, statistically significant higher levels of death and other harms. It starts coming down at that 500 meter mark, but it doesn't actually catch up to the general populace studies or statistics until about double that at almost 1,000 meters or 3,000 plus feet. So we should never allow these things in at close range. And then there's a website that you can go to say, gee, where are those big cell towers and those big antennas? If you go to antennasearch.com here in the US, you can put in any address and it will give you a reasonable, you know, replication of where these things are within 3 miles of you. So I put in the State House address when I was testifying. And within 3 miles of the Beacon Hill office buildings at our State House, we have 1,520 towers with a total of more than 4,500 of these giant antennas. And now those antennas, you'll notice if you look, are being painted the color of the buildings and just slapped right on the building, or they're being hidden on top of the building, sometimes behind a facade, because currently our current law says, well, if it's not aesthetically pleasing, then you could complain. So they think now if they can paint it the color of the building or hide it on top, that it should be okay, but they've completely ignored the biology on this. So here in, this is one neighborhood in Boston where we just looked at an address of a citizen who reached out to me, and look how densely populated Hyde Park was over on Ruskin Road. And remember, these signals travel for miles, and look at the electro pollution that they're putting us through. So go ahead and use these resources. So what is 5G? 5G simply means fifth generation technology. About every 10 years, we have a new generation of technology. The industry is spinning it up that we're going to have faster entertainment downloads, smart cities, super highways, you know, but at the risk of losing us, our pollinators, and every other living cell on the planet. And if you go and take a look at who's buying up the entertainment industry, it's the same companies that are promoting these faster download speeds so you can have faster streaming. So it's another revenue stream for the industry. And it's not like 5G is replacing 3G and 4G. So right now, the way your cell phone receives signal from outside is these longer wavelengths for 3G and 4G can travel through objects very easily. And that includes your body and mind. It's microwaving us as it comes through. But all that's left to monetize are these tiny little millimeter waves. And so in order to keep making money on new revenue innovation, the industry is pitching it that they will create fast speeds, but in order to do so, they're going to need to have cell towers everywhere, every 2 to 12 houses inside our neighborhoods, no longer out in industrial parks far away from us, inside our neighborhoods, every 2 to 12 houses, close to your devices, so usually no higher than bedroom height, so that they can beamform 5G millimeter waves right to your device. And mind you, that beam is going to go through anything in its path to get to that device. But they still need the longer wavelengths of 3G and 4G. So they've got a whole mix of all these different frequencies and wavelengths in what they're calling 5G. And every company is doing it differently. So there is no one thing that is 5G. It's a marketing term. So they're adding on the millimeter waves, and they're going to put them everywhere. And they come in often in literally the cover of darkness, clear the trees, either lop them off or totally take them away, so that their little tiny millimeter waves can travel. And it's a horrible thing for our communities. Meanwhile, we're hearing stories out of Boston and plans in inner cities in many communities where they're now planting more trees to create a canopy for natural shade that will help to keep our communities cool, especially in the hot weather. And then here you have the industry coming in and lopping off the trees so their dinky little millimeter waves can get through. So we really need your help in educating our communities that there's a big trade-off with 5G. So Senator Richard Blumenthal out of Connecticut, he represents Connecticut up in Washington, D.C. He was at a congressional hearing for the Commerce Committee, and he said to two industry leaders, so please tell us, how much money have you invested to ensure that 5G was safe before it came to market? And you can watch this little 4-minute clip, and you'll see the industry guys going hamana, hamana, and then ultimately they say, well, we don't really know about any non-industry funded testing that's been done. So Senator Blumenthal says, so basically we're flying blind here as far as health and safety is concerned. So they know it. They know it up on Capitol Hill, and still they have done nothing to protect the public. So Computer World and others are reporting 5G is a bad joke. It's a great revenue stream for the industry, but we're really not getting anything better. It's not giving us faster speeds, and it's certainly not everywhere. You know, so they're doing it. And I know Dr. Brown was with us today, and he and Dr. Beverly Rubik put out a paper during the pandemic that showed that where 5G, like, look at Boston. In addition to the map I showed on the previous slide, this is how densified these small cells have become in Boston. So they looked at the radio frequency exposure levels, and included in their assessment the towns that have integrated 5G and turned it on. Sometimes they're putting these canisters like right on light poles and street lights and hanging them on wires. And they've only got the 4G brought much closer, which is bad enough. And maybe that's all that they've turned on so far, but through a software update, there's an array of antennas in there that they can turn on this additional millimeter wave frequencies. So what did they find? They found that in areas that had 5G and high wireless radio frequency signaling, that there were increased COVID rates and increased death rates. And we're not suggesting that 5G caused COVID, but once we know enough about the science, what we do know is that our biological cells only have so much energy in them, and that's pretty well calibrated to get you and I through our everyday and nighttime cell repair. When we leave ourselves in 24/7 electrosmog, we get many times to a tipping point, and then there's this whole domino effect where our body can't keep up with the cell repair and regeneration, and then we see all these diseases and illnesses showing up that we've talked about today. So this paper is very good. Be careful though, sometimes when you open your mouth and you say wireless is bad and COVID-19 in the same breath, all they will hear is that, and they're going to think you're assuming it caused it. That's not what the message is. The message is we've got to peel back all of these environmental toxins, because once you have a body that's already being bombarded with radiation, and then you have a virus come in on top of it, what has your body got left to fight with? So we need to protect our immune systems from all environmental exposures. Okay. So that's all the bad news, you guys. I'm going to spend a couple minutes and whip through the last slides so that you know what's there, and then you can go and look on your own. I want to give a shout out to Dr. Magda Havas. She was co-chair of the EMF Medical Conference. She has retired from Trent University up in Canada, professor emeritus, which means she retired with honors. And she taught EMFs for decades up there. She recognizes that our governments, by and large, have dropped the ball and are not monitoring all this cumulative radiation coming at us from all these different environmental exposures. So she started the Global EMF Monitoring Project. And as science indicates, we need to use the same tools. So anybody who gets a hold of, through their library or through purchase, the Safe and Sound Pro 2 meter, you can be a citizen scientist and help her gather data. There's a sheet that you just put on a clipboard and grab a buddy and go outside for a couple hours and measure down your main street at like 5 different intersections on all 4 corners, or if it's a T, you do what would be the intersection. You just go out and you use her protocol, you take the measurements, and then you enter them into her database. And then we will create a map that tells whether you can brag about your community. And she chose that BRAG acronym to represent B for Black, where it's over $100,000 and we are in deep trouble, very high. R for Red, where it's high, 10,000 to 100,000 microwatts. A for Amber in the medium, we're starting to head toward trouble, where it's 1,000 to 10,000. And low green would be less than 10,000. Now, these are outdoor measurements, and these presume that you're not staying for any length of time under this transmission, and that you have a safe environment to go home and clean up with. So if you would like to participate in Dr. Havas's study, please reach out to globalemf.net. And these guidelines are based on scientists who came together in Salzburg many years ago and suggested that if we could be at least at 1,000 or less outdoors, we might have a chance of repairing properly at home. So if you are interested in participating, if you don't yet have the meter, reach out to globalemf.net and say you would like to be a citizen scientist, and ask for a discount code. Rob Metzinger of Safe Living Technologies has partnered with Dr. Havas. And I know when I bought my meter through this program, instead of paying $400, I think I paid like 308 maybe. And so that's like a 20 or 25% discount that you might receive. So please, it feels good to do something positive when sometimes we just want to curl up into a ball and never come out again. So let's do what we can. But here's what some of the real measurements are looking like today. Again, we want to be less than 1,000 outdoors. When Lori measured, I think up in Westmoreland, New Hampshire, they were at 417 at their fire department. We measured in Keene before their small cells went in, and it was already heading toward danger, and now those small cells are in. Nashua in the red zone, Concord, New Hampshire, Stratham, New Hampshire. They put a massive cell tower right up along their main strip. And here in the north end of Boston, they had put these small cells, as we saw all over Boston, on the main road in the north end, which is where all of our lovely Italian restaurants and bakeries are. We get tourists down there day and night, and these are not just pretty lampposts. These are cell towers at the curb, right where the public is traveling all day. And worse, right outside the homes that are above all the businesses at the ground level. So that's all the bad news. Now let's see what's happening, because there's a ton of good news happening. Martin Luther King Jr. taught us that when important change happens in our society, it comes through 3 channels. The first is the public becomes informed and then does something. And that's what we're hoping to inspire today. Second, it goes through the courts and the guilty are held accountable. And third, public policy is finally enacted to protect you and I. So I'll leave it to you to go through these slides, but I'll talk to you about a couple of important things. The FCC, when Dr. Shuren told the FCC, don't worry about these big studies showing cancer, keep doing what you're doing. The FCC documented that they're not going to change their public radiation exposure limits that were set way back in '96. When they recorded that in something called the Federal Register, then the lawsuits could happen, and a bunch of people came out to sue. 2 of them were the Environmental Health Trust and Children's Health Defense, and the courts combined all these lawsuits into one. And it went before the DC Circuit Court of Appeals down in Washington. And at the end of the day, 3 judges were presented with all the evidence, or most of the evidence, that was put into that public docket that the FCC opened up. 11,000 pages of scientific, medical, and citizen evidence of harm. At the end of the day, the judges looked through all that science and said to the FCC, so show us your homework. How did you decide that you're going to stick with those archaic limits from 1996? And the FCC said, well, the FDA said it was fine. And so they said, well, where's the FDA's homework? And they don't have any. Not one of our federal agencies have investigated top to bottom the science on man-made radio frequency radiation. So we have a huge regulatory gap. And that's why we say there is no cavalry coming. We've got to deal with this in our own space and then help our communities. So actually, it was Friday the 13th of August in 2021. The court ordered the FCC to account for vulnerabilities to our children, to our environment with the pollinators, for long-term impacts, because the only testing they ever did for those FCC limits was how much heat from a device in a half an hour. Or 6 minutes even, has nothing to do with 24 radiation at the 24/7 radiation at the non-thermal level. The courts ordered the FCC to account for infertility and a host of other things. And now we're coming up this next week on 2 years, and the FCC has done nothing. So Children's Health Defense and the Environmental Health Trust have filed other things to try and get them moving on this. There have been many other lawsuits all across the nation. Here's where you can find that cease and desist order from Pittsfield, Massachusetts, the first in the nation for a board of health to take Verizon to the mat. And we're hoping that the courts are going to support that, and that the cease and desist order will be reinstated, and that the health authorities will have the power to get their citizens back home safely. So many, many lawsuits happening. But again, we don't hear about it through mainstream media because that's owned by industry. And then in the public policy, I mentioned that we've had bills here for nearly 10 years. Massachusetts has chosen to do nothing to protect the public. We've gotten them out of committee and we're grateful for those movements, but we need meaningful action. When we educated New Hampshire Representative Patrick Abrami, also an engineer, he started looking at the science. Deb Hodgson and I helped him to connect the dots. They drove down to my house in Massachusetts. We sat at my kitchen table. He wrote a very powerful bill asking pointed questions. Why have Lloyd's of London, Swiss Re, AM Best, and others long since recognized this is a leading world risk? And they put exclusions in their policies so our towns can be left holding the bag on liability. Why does that legal fine print even exist to say keep it away from the body? Why is the FCC ignoring thousands of studies? Why are they only talking about heat or thermal effects when the science documents all these non-thermal, non-ionizing biological effects? And why do we still allow 100 times more radiation than certain other countries do? And why is nobody looking at the cumulative effect of putting a child in a classroom with 20 or 30 devices constantly radiating, plus all the wireless infrastructure? So we brought in experts, got that bill passed into law in less than 7 months in New Hampshire. And they spent a year investigating, even during the pandemic, and came out with this groundbreaking law commission report by law that documents the corruption with the FCC, the FDA, and the industry. And it gives 15 specific recommendations to get our federal delegates back on the ball with this, get our state level agencies on the ball with this, and educate the public and start transitioning away from wireless tech and over to safe, hardwired technology, run fiber optics or high-speed cable right to the building, pick up with Ethernet cables indoors, and teach everybody to turn off those radiating antennas. So Kent Chamberlain from the University of New Hampshire served on that commission. He's a 30-year EMF engineer. He didn't know the health risks. And now he's done a complete 180 and he's out there educating the public with talks and slides. So there are other bills that have been introduced to implement the setbacks that are recommended in the report to get a registry of harm going. And Frank Clegg sent in testimony again, and he highlights that wireless is no longer advanced technology. It's outlived its useful life for main connectivity. We need to be hardwired and turn off the wireless. You can share his testimony with others. So every time we keep making inroads in New Hampshire, the industry and their deep pockets get in there and start persuading the legislature that they need this for the economy, and then they kill the bills. But as one door closes, another opens. We have a really good bill in Maine that's trying to do that commission report that New Hampshire did. Connecticut also had a good bill this session. We have 6 bills in Massachusetts. For the first time, we are asking for a registry, and we already have something called MAVEN, where we track food poisoning, we track COVID, we track Parkinson's and all sorts of diseases. It's time to include electromagnetic sensitivities in that. So doctors, local town boards, and health agents can start reporting on all the people who are getting sick, because once we have better data, we can make better health policy. So feel free to look at all the bills. There are many more in other states. And the industry routinely comes in and says, oh, if anybody says they don't want this cell tower here, those are just the NIMBYs, not in my backyard. When actually, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of groups all over the country already working hard on this. You can go to Americans for Responsible Technology and look at those groups. And if you want to see about cell towers en masse, there's a ton of information here. There are towns all over the country banding together and taking action on this. Again, we don't hear it through mainstream media, but we can quickly help you get to many important things that are happening. And public servants are bringing to this town, and you can see here where Easton, Connecticut, when a grandmother figured this out, she took it to her town. They had a doctor on their health board. They had put a moratorium on any 5G build out until it can be proven safe. And they re-upped that moratorium recently too. So check it out. It's happening all over. So for our schools, as we head into the back to school season, we have got to stop radiating our kids in schools. We can still use technology, but it should be a secondary learning experience, not replacing our teachers. Louisiana just passed a law where a team of medical doctors got together. They passed it unanimously through the House, through the Senate, and into law, that they now have a set of guidance that they worked with their Department of Education for digital devices. It talks about the damage to the eyes. It talks about obesity, anxiety, depression. And they weren't able to take the EMFs head on because ed tech would have come in and squished them, but they are coming at it first level to get it out of the classroom and get those kids outside. We know that children develop through meaningful connections with others. They develop through movement and through touch and through communicating with the natural environment, not through digital screens. And in fact, the Netherlands and Finland and others have announced that they are removing it from the classrooms, except where medically necessary, and in the labs where digital skills are taught, but they are not teaching through screens anymore. New York Times did a series of articles years ago that talked about what Silicon Valley execs do. They are sending their kids to schools with no technology. They're having their nannies sign contracts that there will be no screens around their kids, but yet they pushed in that 21st century classroom into our schools. Again, solutions. Our friends Doug and Patty Wood at Grassroots Environmental Education have built Americans for Responsible Tech, where they've got a whole toolkit for you to use in your community. They've now built Tech Safe Schools, where they will send information to your schools if you contact them and help you to open that conversation with your schools about the legal, the health, and then the remediation solutions. The Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition has worked with experts, and they've already built K through 12 curriculum for prevention of harm from cell phones and other wireless tech. Dr. Alexia McKnight, the veterinarian radiologist who got so sick from her smart meter, she and I were brought into her children's schools on Professional Development Day, and we gave 4 talks throughout the day. And that content is available here for you as well. Our slides are included in the video. And then, as I said, we have off-the-shelf training to do mass training in about a half an hour online. And our friends at Environmental Health Trust have a plethora of single page, double-sided. They've got postcards, little handouts, all sorts of amazing resources for you to carry with you to open this conversation credibly. So please go look at all these amazing resources for our schools. The first medical school textbook just came out, and over at Physicians for Safe Technology, Dr. Cindy Russell and others have all the science laid out and all the harms and all the solutions for all of our healthcare practitioners to go learn from. And there are many resources for all the professions out there to glean credible information. So some of us are do-it-yourselfers. Some of us are horrified at the thought. Please know there are, aside from electricians who can just come in and put Ethernet jacks all over your home, there are building biologists who are highly trained and certified to come into a space, a home or an office or a school, measure not only for the electromagnetic fields, but there are those who are also certified to do the mold and the formaldehyde and the VOCs and all of the indoor environmental pollutants. You can hire them to come in. This Film Generations app is now available through Amazon Prime. And our libraries, most of them have it through Canopy or Hoopla. So you can just watch this with your loved ones, your colleagues, get the parents together and the grandparents of all the kids that your kids hang out with. And it's a really good way to start this conversation. Bert Wolf, through Camilla Reese and Dr. Erica Mallory Blythe, have done 2 half-hour episodes on PBS. How cool is that? And here's that toolkit that you can take and start working in your community. And again, it's not just about the EMFs and the radiation. It's about getting our lives back in balance, getting back out to nature, getting back out to true, meaningful connections with people, and avoiding excessive screen time. So it's important that we start, noticing what we're doing and then set limits. I love this poster with all these reminders of what we can do to keep ourselves healthy and meaningfully connect with others and be creative again and model that good behavior, because our kids are big fans of monkey see, monkey do. Dr. Laura Conover has done a book called The Earth Prescription, where she's taken it season by season, because here in the Northeast, we can't walk around barefoot, but to remind us that every day we should be naturally connecting with the Earth's electromagnetic field, because that will help to regulate and get rid of some of the man-made junk that we're immersed in, but regulate our own bioelectrical systems. So she takes us through all 4 seasons, and it's really a lovely read. And you can learn about the science too. So, all right. So our goal for all of us, personally and out in our communities, is to get to what the Centers for Disease Control already calls the ALARA principle. Get to as low as reasonably achievable with anything that has to do with man-made radiation. And here are resources for our communities to reinvestigate what's happening. This book, Reinventing Wires, is really good. You can print it out for free online. And always measure against biological effects. And, we know what those numbers should be, not what the industry and the FCC are telling us. So there's no safe level of man-made radiation, so we shouldn't kid ourselves. Once it's been called a carcinogen, any amount of it is carcinogenic, and we know it's way more than just cancer. So Dr. Linda Birnbaum, who headed up the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences when that NTP study was done, she knows we've got captured agencies. There are still some really good people at the federal level, and it's going to take us empowering them coming up from the local and state levels, she thinks, before we'll see meaningful change. So let's keep educating. Come to our future sessions. Those are always available at Massachusetts for Safe Technology on our events page. And then I can be brought in to do public education webinars for your towns or your professional organizations. And let's start training our schools and staff as soon as possible. We should not be locking our kids into buildings with radiation again. So start where you are. What associations do you belong to? They're often looking for public speakers, and that's my happy place, is educating others. So our town should be, now that tech is here to stay, they should be having tech safety committees. They should make sure that if they've got, smart meters in the community, that there are opt-outs for people who cannot live in a home with that radiation. And you need to start talking to your local towns and get their zoning bylaws up to speed. And thankfully, we have guidance for that. Most town attorneys are wonderful, but they are no match for the wireless industry. So you need to hire a consultant. Somebody like Andrew Campanelli for about $8,500 can look at your state law. He knows the federal law inside and out because he used to work for telecom until he figured out what they were doing. And then he will look at your local zoning code and rewrite it so that you have as strong of a code as you can have under current law. So for today, start noticing what's radiating around you. Don't beat yourself up for what you've already done. Start with baby steps to fix it. Above everything else, protect your sleep so you can do proper repair, and then find your way, migrate over to Ethernet cables and adapters, and keep everything in airplane mode as often as you can, and only turn on the one antenna that you need. And then again, here's some samples of what Environmental Health Trust has. So use their resources. And we thank you for giving us 2 hours of your day to learn about this. We know it's like drinking water out of a fire hose. So come back as many times as you want and keep learning with us. You can reach out to New Hampshire for Safe Technology. This is their Facebook page. You can also go directly to New Hampshire for Safe Technology at gmail.com. Same thing, I have a website that has a lot of good resources on it. No sense reinventing the wheel. If that's something you want to develop for your town or your state, by all means, just reach out and you can customize it for your own means. And then you can also reach out to me at ma4safetech@gmail.com. So I'll stop sharing. And if Lori is still with us, if you want to take a look at the chat and let me know if there are any questions we can help with.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
Deborah had a few questions if Deborah wants to share.
Okay, is that Deb Chandler?
Yes.
Okay, Deb, do you want to unmute and ask your questions?
Hi, everybody.
Hi,
Well,
Deb.
here's the thing. I finally, at around noontime, had a direct intervention with the 5G trucks right in my front yard.
Oh,
Yeah. So basically, I would love best practices to follow up from here, because what happened was I was here in my condo. I'm in a condo complex and on the second floor, and I heard trucks and I looked out the window and I saw these 3 bucket trucks with the name Buckley. I have their full name on some photos I took. They're a subcontractor to Comcast.
mhm.
So I've been wondering, since living here for 8+ years, whether they could come in here with the 5G. And my understanding was that so my town in South Hadley has its own electric company, and they've contracted to put in fiber optic with fiber spring. And my last understanding was that that was the only way people were going to possibly get 5G to their units, was once the fiber optic was put in. So I haven't seen this. The trucks have not been here. This is technically private property. Our road is private. They plow it themselves.
Mhm.
So I've just been on the lookout for that. Well, then this morning, well, like I said, it was, I think, at around noontime, these trucks show up, and I didn't know what the company was. I couldn't see them clearly. So
Yeah.
I went down and spoke to the guys. I was very nice to them, but I'm asking them, hey, what are you guys doing?
I'm not gonna get it, honey.
Oh, please mute if you're not actively
Right
participating.
here.
So, I knew to be very nice to those guys. I mean, they're not the ones that probably put the orders in place, but they clearly told me they are there to upgrade the equipment to increase the 5G signal. And I said, well, where are these mini cells? Because I haven't seen them on the street anywhere. And he pointed, the building right next to me has a box, probably about this big, attached to the building down at the ground level. And I said, well, I don't understand. I didn't get any notification. And how is it that you guys can put that on private property? Did the HOA approve this? The housing authority, not authority, what do you call it? Homeowners Association.
Mhm.
So they're like, no, Comcast owns that space. Now, this doesn't make sense to me. How can they own the space right up against a building, and then there's a lawn, and then there's the street, right? I mean, a variance, it doesn't make sense to me. But these guys, I just got the sense they're just doing their job, right?
Right.
So I just kept digging. I kept asking them more questions. And between all of us here, I took a voice recording with my phone of the whole thing. They didn't know that, but, and they barely wanted to give their first names. So I said, you guys, I am in a position now where I'm already hypersensitive. I need to stop this. I made it clear to them. I said, I need to call the HOA. I even need to call my local police to get this on record. And they're just saying, we're just being told what they're doing. So anyway, I got the name of their company, the the phone number. And then finally, one of them called their supervisor, got the supervisor on the phone. And then I spoke to the supervisor. He said he will stop their job today. And the trucks drove away. I have a video.
Congratulations, Deb. That's
Now, what's
fantastic.
interesting, thank you.
Yeah.
I was shaking like a leaf.
I
What's
bet.
interesting is I watched them turn around and drive out, but they took a right into one of the little pods of buildings. They didn't go out to the main road. So then I wanted to come on your webinar and participate and tell you and ask advice. So I figure they're just placating me. Let's be honest, right? I'm just one little peanut, but I did hand them your 4-sided document, Cece. And I don't know if you talked about it before I came on here.
Is that the EMF points of confusion versus fact?
Yes, with the last page being the symptom, and you have a link to it on the website. So I've been giving that out to people lately, and I gave it to those guys. And I got, when I was speaking with look at the piece of paper. The guy took forever to find a piece of paper and a pen because they're all wireless.
Right.
The phone. So I wrote down the name of the supervisor that I was talking to and the owner of the company, Kevin Buckley. He's out of Pennsylvania. These guys were working out of their office in Connecticut. But the thing is, these guys, just as we're talking about, they don't know the harms.
Right.
And I was standing there on my front lawn, so half the neighborhood could hear me. You know, I have a big mouth. And I educated them as best I could in the moment. Oh, someone's asking if we can share that document in the
I'm
chat.
putting it in right now.
I figured you were, because I find that to be the best and the latest shot in the arm right there. It's 4 pages, easy, the way you formatted it. So I feel like I had a little victory, but the problem now is that.
Did you have your meter with you, Deb?
No, I didn't bring that down.
Yeah.
I didn't bring that down, but like I said, I did a voice recording of what they're all saying, and their ignorance on the subject was very clear, very clear.
Yeah, we found that time and again. And for example, it's interesting that you mentioned Comcast, because when I was down in 2015 at a Rhode Island disabilities hearing, somebody had brought up then that Comcast Xfinity was putting personal hotspots on our routers. And so I caught a van that was in my neighborhood and I asked him about it. And he said, yeah, don't tell my boss, but those things are draining the signal off of your router to send signal out to the curb to their customers going by. And he said, I keep getting called in because people were working from home and they were getting a crummy signal. And so, so then I learned later that when we were switching over to Comcast, I knew to turn off the 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz antennas. And then I also knew to turn off the 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz hotspot antennas. And I did that because I could do it right online through my account.
Right.
But then I went down to measure, because I always have to measure, right? And it was still off the charts on my router. And I'm like, well, what is it? And I had remembered Peter Sullivan had said there's a 5th antenna in there.
Yep.
And I contacted him to say, what is it? And he said, well, you're going to have to call up Comcast and their frontline tech support, just like the guys you met with on the street. They don't know this stuff. You will have to ask for a tier 2 tech support person that would get you to an engineer. And from their end, they could turn off the home security antenna, which we weren't even using. It wasn't a service we wanted. But just like with our cell phones, they give us these boxes with everything transmitting all the time.
And you were the one that told me that a while ago when I noticed my meter still going in the red with my Xfinity gateway modem, which is actually a router. And I switched it out. They didn't, I think I even spoke to tier 2 tech and they didn't know about that. You were the one that told me. That's why I come here. And I went and ordered myself a modem on eBay for $20. I can give folks the name of it. I don't know if I've given it to you, Cece. It's I want to say it's a Linksys brand. And it's old enough and it's only about this big by that thick. And it's old enough that never had the capability to take wireless. I've got my
Excellent.
laptop plugged into that thing with my Ethernet.
Yeah, that would be helpful, Deb. I know one of my girlfriends out in California just went to look for one and she bought it, but I think it came from another country, which has a different
Oh,
plug.
okay. So, but the other, all right, so I want feedback on.
There are a couple other people with questions, so.
Okay, so I also just want to mention though that last week, my landline service was getting really staticky. So I had to call tech support. Guy came here, and I'm not going to mention his name, but he's a special services tech, extremely knowledgeable, extremely, has a lot of high access.
Mhm.
He and I had a chat in the driveway for about an hour. I also handed him your papers. He knows, he knows. I didn't record him talking. I didn't do that, but he is very aware that 5G is trouble. And I've got his private phone number now, so we can chat. But I
Good.
would like anyone's feedback on what I should do here next, because as you know, I'm already facing, I went to court yesterday with a no fault eviction here. So I already have a
I
complicated.
know, I was gonna ask offline, but.
No, I
I'm
mean,
glad
so
you're
I'll
still
let
here
other
for today.
turn. I'm just not sure what is the right next step to take with this, because I'm going to be here a while longer. The eviction's going to take possibly up to a year.
Yeah, well, I would suggest go out and measure, right?
Yeah.
And see if things are really transmitting or if they're increasing. We
Yeah.
can put you in touch with Mary Bacon out in Minneapolis.
Okay.
She and her neighbors during the pandemic noticed a truck come up and they started digging a hole right on their corner. And it turns out they were going to put up a 5G small cell right there outside of somebody's home who already has, I think, MS.
Yep.
And so they started a very peaceful citizens standout demonstration. The police were called by the guy in the truck. The policeman came out and he listened to the citizens and he said, well, I think we need to really just put a pause on this and talk to the town.
Yeah.
The truck
I
came back another
honestly-
day. They did a telephone tree. And as soon as the truck showed up, the neighbors all came out and peacefully stood.
Yeah.
And so now the police supervisor was called in. He came and he said, well, these citizens really don't want this here. Third time, the police captain, I think, comes down. And all three times, the citizens were respectful. And at one point, one of the industry guys snagged one of the neighbors and said, hey, keep doing what you're doing, because as long as there's cars or people here, they can't install that pole.
Well, I appreciate all that, but I'm at a point.
I know, but now you've got little boxes.
I mean, the thing is, after my hearing yesterday at the courthouse, my mediation, then I get into a car accident and I've got bodily injury and I got to call my insurance after I'm done with you guys.
Oh, Deb.
It's like God has a sense of humor with Deb right now in these last 24 hours. I don't have the time and energy to do a protest. I want to know, can I serve a cease and desist as a tenant here? And how do I get that in motion when I think you're clear? I can't afford an attorney.
You know what you might do?
Also, no one else here, I'm not aware of.
Call the Massachusetts Association of Health Boards
Okay.
and see.
Those are the people that did the.
They put an amicus brief in on the Pittsfield court case.
Yeah.
So call and ask them what you should be doing right now. I would also suggest you reach out to Patty and Doug Wood, because they've worked on this more hands-on than I have.
Yep.
Try those two things and then circle back.
Okay.
All right.
Thank
Ellen,
you.
you've been so patient. It's so lovely to see you.
It's good to see you, Cece. So on your recommendation, when the Verizon tech came to my house to upgrade my system, I wanted to take my TV off of my phone bill because I wasn't using it. So he came out and he did all that, and he also upgraded my my system, the wireless system to a higher level. I think he said 300 over 300, and I was at 25 over 25, whatever those numbers mean. I have no clue. But I asked him if he could please put the router in the basement, because it was right here next to me at my computer. And it's like, no, I remember Cece saying that router needs to go away. You need to be
Yeah, you
at least
definitely
3
want.
feet away.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
definitely want distance. There's no safe level of microwave radiation. So you
Yeah.
definitely, as a next step, want to start hardwiring.
Yeah, I do, and I'll talk to you personally about that. But I said, you know, I don't want this next to me because of the EMF radiation. And he says, I don't know anything about that.
Mm.
The technician installing it said
Most
he knew
people
nothing
don't.
about that. And I said, of course you don't. They don't want you to know about it.
Mhm. Yeah,
So he
so
was,
that's why, you know, if you want to, Ellen, in the chat, I put the link to this little handout that you can just print out a half a dozen of them and just have
Yeah.
them on hand.
I will do that.
Yeah, because otherwise it's really hard to establish credibility and people are thinking, oh, she's a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, oh, okay, well, good. All
Yeah.
right, any other questions that we should field before we go here? Okay, and somebody did have in the chat, is this going to be recorded? It is being recorded, and in a few days we will send it out to everybody who registered. And there's Eagle Eye Barb Payne. Hi, Barb. I was in such a rush getting out my dates for August and September that I goofed a couple of things, and Barb, being a really good writer, said, hey, Cece. So I fixed it in the thing that went out today. So welcome, Barb, and thank you.
So Deb, Cece, Nancy asked if Alexa was on. It's something you could hardwire. I think she asked that. Is Nancy still there?
To answer the question, I don't know. You would have to look at it and see if it has an Ethernet port or if there's an adapter that could then be plugged in to an Ethernet cable to an Ethernet port.
Right, that isn't quite what I was asking. I
Okay,
was asking if anyone knew if there was an Alexa compatible device that was available, because most of the devices do not have an Ethernet port.
that I don't know, unless you would consider your cell phone to have that technology, because I know my husband has an Android phone and we can hardwire that, and then he can just say to his Android, you know, do whatever.
Right.
Oh, okay,
Same idea, asking
Yeah.
Siri on
See, we just saved you
on
money
an
too.
iPhone. Yeah.
Yeah,
right, okay, good idea, thank you.
cool.
Now, I was off the call. I was muted because I had to take a call from somebody, but
Okay.
when Deborah was asking about the Comcast upgrade, I was unclear because isn't when they upgrade Comcast, isn't that a hardwired system that they have? Like Xfinity is hardwired, and then you choose whether you want Wi-Fi wireless in your house. But when they upgrade Comcast, it's all, I believe it's hardwired. A system is hardwired. When they upgrade it, it doesn't, it's not, am I
So-
wrong about that?
If I may, I mean, I was, of course, shaking like a leaf while I was talking to those guys, but when I said, they said they were there to upgrade, you know, they were hired by Comcast as a subcontractor. I said upgrading the 5G, and they said yes. And those are, I forget what they called them, but they're wireless transmitters that they're dealing with. So I believe it is
Oh.
all wireless, not wired. And yeah, I don't know who needs to give permission to whom to do all this, but you know, I'm sure I'm going to deal with a lot of passing of the buck until I get right down to it, you know.
Interesting,
Yeah.
because when I have Comcast Xfinity at the Cape House, it's all wired.
Yeah, but this
and-
is on the outside of the buildings and it's somehow connected all the way out to the main road. But I will get to the bottom of it, and it is wireless, and they were hearing me about the concern about the wireless. It was clear it was wireless. They just weren't, you know, they were not knowledgeable yet on the harms related to it.
Yeah. So
So-
Lori, I think the distinction you're making is that all of us get internet to the premises. And that usually comes through a cable that's attached to our house that then gets attached to a box inside of our house.
Right, that's what, yeah,
So, and that's a perfectly fine solution, right? We don't need to have wireless components to have great technology.
Right.
But what a lot of these, what I learned when I was out in Worcester one day, I was asked to attend a meeting. And I was so excited when they said, you know, they're making it a priority to put fiber optics to the premises. But then a few minutes later, they said, well, some people are going to want wireless services and some people aren't. So they're going to allow the wireless in too. So they're putting both in. So the fiber optics can be a Trojan horse for
Mhm.
wireless infrastructure.
Mhm. I'm thinking that technically what they're putting in here would be considered an OTARD, right? I'm thinking, because we talked about the OTAR, over the air reception device, which is like a 5G beacon for everybody
Yeah.
within
That's a
distance.
great analogy, Deb, and that
Yeah.
does sound like that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
so. Well, Barb, did you have a question? I do see your hand is raised.
Yes, actually, that last thing that Deborah just said,
Mhm.
up here, I'm in Canada, we call that fixed wireless,
Okay,
just to make the conversation even more difficult, right?
right. So it's not a small cell tower. It's fixed wireless because they fixed it on your building somewhere.
Yeah.
Wow.
And what I was going to say, it occurred to me while I was listening to you folks today that when I listen in on US gatherings, I'm not sure if I've heard anybody mention this, and I don't know if it's something that's available to you. I understand there's the discussion about, you know, if people have electromagnetic sensitivity and there's the ADA and all that stuff. However, again, here in Canada, our experience is that not for a cell phone tower or anything outside, but for the service at home, you can actually speak to the accessibility department of Bell, head office here in Canada, and they will help you. And they even have it on a list. Like when they have you fill in the form, it'll say, you know, vision impairment, like actual mobility, you know, like, you know, if somebody's rides a wheelchair or whatever. And on the list, it says, I don't know it verbatim, but it says something like sensitivity to odors or electronics. Like it's on the list. It's not even that you tick off
Really?
other and fill it in.
Hey, Barb, if you could get a hold of that and send me a copy, I'd love to see it.
Yep, I have
And
it.
then
Yeah,
we can share that with other people. That's amazing.
because and again, I've not noticed because usually I don't have to call somewhere in the US, but
Yeah.
any website in Canada almost now of a big company, and I don't mean just telecom, I mean any big
Yeah.
company, usually somewhere near the bottom navigation. It's not necessarily obvious on the page, but near the very bottom of the
Mhm.
web page, there'll be a tab for accessibility. And it might be designed for other things. However, it is the person to talk to.
Thank you so much for that, Barb. Yeah, there's, I think the money is flowing now from government into communities to set up committees for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I would love to have a copy of what you have to say, hey, yeah, this is what we're talking about. We want people to be able to have accessibility.
Now
love that.
that
Thank you.
accessibility department is having its own hands tied somewhat by the company, but but they try to stick it out and try to help you. It's quite amazing, actually.
Excellent. Excellent.
May
Yeah,
I
I do
mention-
think that the people working in those departments are compassionate,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
Yeah.
I-
Super. Thanks, Barb.
I
All
wanted
right,
to
so
add
you have your hand
something.
raised?
I wanted to add something directly related to that.
Yeah.
Cece. Here in Massachusetts, they just started to institute something at the retailer level. And I know Walmart is one. On Saturday mornings, I think between 8 and 10 a.m., they will accommodate people with sensory processing disorder. So they're mostly targeting kids with autism. They're not shutting off the wireless, but they are shutting down the fluorescent lighting. They are putting all of the televisions on a static image instead of video, and they're shutting off the music. So I saw that on one of my, EMF pages, and I said, wow, this is a start. Because if we can ride the coattails of that as far as the wireless, we're getting somewhere, right?
Oh, wonderful.
I wanted to just add that in. I think it's at the Massachusetts level, and I know Walmart is going to be doing it, and Chuck E. Cheese, which I have no business going there, and I forget which other retailers.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we have a grocery chain that does that. It's not one of the major ones. And
Mhm.
actually, there is somebody who did get them to manage to get them to turn off the wireless too.
Oh, good. And where is that?
I'm not sure. Somewhere in province of Ontario.
If there's a way to send that info to Cece and possibly to me, I would love to see that as an example.
Yeah, because one of the bills that we have this session, it's new. Scott McCullough helped to write it for, I think it's Courtney Gilardi's senator. That would include more civil rights so that people can ask for reasonable accommodations when they go out and about.
Yep.
But that's really good to know too, Deb, that it's already being done for sensory processing disorders.
And it's
that may
funny.
actually help to get this bill passed.
Yeah.
And it's in the name too. You could say that this is a sensory disorder.
Yeah.
Like, you can't dispute that. It is.
Yeah, and there are people that will argue that, hey, it's damaging everybody. We're just the canaries in the coal mine here.
No. To get something, I'm not being contrary. Please don't understand. I'm just sort of talking in shorthand. Don't switch into that mode when you're trying to negotiate something like this. Don't try to save the planet. Try to save the store and the people in it, right?
Because as Cece said, the ADA already recognizes this for a couple decades now.
Yeah, we just need some teeth behind it.
Yeah, I got new teeth as of this morning.
Good. Well, Director Gallegos, who's in charge of the disabilities up at the ADA, he's been listening to Libby Kelly and Dr. Magda Havas and Sheena Symington and Susie, and those guys have been educating. So there's always hope, and there's so much being done behind the scenes.
Oh, yeah.
But I really appreciate you guys sharing your experiences with this so that we can, document it and then help others to maybe benefit from it too.
Yeah. Well,
okay, everybody. Any last questions? You've been wonderful to stay for 2.5 hours.
Well, I will invite everybody like I did in the chat. I shared one of the screen captures of my blood with the rouleau effect going on really seriously. I had that done last week, and the man that is doing that is in Wilbraham, and he wants more people to want to have their blood looked at. He's kind of starting a collection of the results. He's very much on board about the EMFs, but as someone else in the chat said, that effect can be caused by other things. I know I've had an oncologist been looking at my blood for 3 years, looking at markers for multiple myeloma. It's just a start. And again, just educating and inviting, and that's free work. So if folks want to connect with that person doing the microscopy, I'll put my email again in the chat.
Okay, thank you so much, Deb. Everybody have a tech safe day, and we will see you next time. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you again, Cece.
Thank you.